Well, I don't think Taylor Swift fans are going to be too happy. Hello everyone and welcome to Rewind Reviews, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the 2024 spy action comedy movie Argylle. Directed by Matthew Vaughn and written by Jason Fuchs, Argylle sees a reclusive author who writes espionage novels about a secret agent and a global spy syndicate realising the plot of the new book she's writing starts to mirror real-world events in real time. The movie stars Bryce Dallas Howard, Sam Rockwell, Henry Cavill, Bryan Cranston, Catherine O'Hara, John Cena, Dua Lipa, Ariana DeBose, Sophia Boutella and Samuel L. Jackson. I'm going to be honest, up until a couple of months ago I didn't actually really know that much about this movie. I only really knew the name, I knew that Henry Cavill was going to be in it, and I knew that it was going to be directed by Matthew Vaughn. And based on that information alone, I was kind of curious to see what it was that the movie was actually going to be. And then when the first trailer was released and we started seeing a little bit more about what the movie was going to actually entail, the story that it was going to be telling, it did actually look quite interesting and it looked quite fun. The premise and the overall concept behind the story of this movie, it did seem really interesting and it did seem quite unique as well. So I thought, let's give it a go. And then about a week before the movie was released, a load of reviews all started getting released online. And they were pretty savage. They were really harsh on this movie. I'm not somebody who really lets reviews actually sway me one way or another when it comes to whether or not I go and see a movie or not. But I will admit, the reviews that I was seeing for this one, I barely saw anything that was really sort of positive or was saying anything really too nice about it. And it did cause a bit of doubt in my mind about how good this movie actually might be. But I thought, you know what? It's better to make up my own mind about this movie. So I decided to go and see it on opening day. And while yes, it definitely does have a lot of problems, I do understand where a lot of those negative reviews are coming from and what it is that they see in it. I don't think it's as bad as they have made it out to be. As I said, the story itself is genuinely quite interesting and it does feel quite unique in the way that it is portraying this particular story. It does borrow elements from other movies. There have been a lot of comparisons to other films that have been released over the years. And I can see those comparisons. I can see where it is that maybe inspiration was drawn for a few different set pieces and a few different sequences. It does have vibes of those other movies. But for the most part, it does tell a fairly original story. And I do feel like the way that it goes about telling it is kind of interesting and it is kind of clever as well. The plot of this movie centres around Ellie Conway, who's played by Bryce Dallas Howard, who's the author of the Argylle spy novel series, but when the events of her new book begin to line up with real events, she finds herself being targeted by a dangerous spy syndicate and her only means of help is a spy called Aidan, played by Sam Rockwell, who may or may not be as trustworthy as he says. Ellie, along with her cat Alfie, are forced on the run and attempt to find out what's real and what's fictional. It's a film that when you actually start watching it, it does come across as quite a simple, straightforward story. But the further through you go, it does start to get quite twisty and quite turny at times, to the point where it can be a little bit confusing. I do feel like there are definitely a lot of moments where some things do make sense. Some of the twists, some of the ideas that they do introduce, that they do bring up, are quite clever and quite interesting. But then there's others that just don't really make sense and do kind of push just how far you're actually willing to suspend your disbelief. They do set a lot of it up. There is a lot of foreshadowing going on. There is definitely a lot of little talk and lots of setup that do build these events up. But not everything does really work within the tone and style that they do kind of set up earlier on in the movie. It's still fun though. I think the biggest problem that I had with it overall was that there is a lot going on in this movie. There is a lot of elements, there is a lot of moving parts to this story that do need to be addressed, that they do need to pay off later on, that do need to get introduced and explored in some way, and there is a lot going on. The movie itself is clocking in at around 2 hours 20 minutes long or thereabouts, and it definitely does feel a bit too long for what this movie actually is trying to do. I do think that there is maybe a little bit too much that they do try and cram into this movie within the runtime. I do think that it is something that maybe they could have just trimmed down on. I do think that there are some sequences that maybe they could have either just trimmed or just cut altogether. And I've got to be honest, there is a little bit of me that does wonder if this movie already has been cut or not, because there are some choice edits in this movie that do feel like they are sort of like cutting away from anything too brutal or too violent on screen. There are definitely moments where it's framed in a way that it looks like when somebody's like getting shot or killed or something, that there would be like a bit of a spurt of blood somewhere. and none of that's in this movie. And I think the reason why this movie does feel a little bit toned down compared to some other Matthew Vaughn movies that have been released over the years, like Kingsman, like Kick-Ass, is that this movie is actually rated a 12A or PG-13 in the US. It really surprised me actually seeing that, because I didn't actually know about this until I was booking my ticket for the movie, when I was going through the cinema listings, and then there it was, Argylle 12A. Wait, hang on, 12A? For context, pretty much all of Matthew Vaughn's movies of the past few years, apart from X-Men First Class, have all been rated 15 because they are very violent and very grown up and mature. Well, not that mature, but I was convinced up until I saw the age certificate that this movie was going to be a 15, just like those other films, so I was quite surprised seeing that age certificate. And I do feel like maybe it does feel like it could have been trimmed. It does feel like maybe they were originally going to be making this movie aim to be an R-rated film or rated a 15. I don't know for 100% certainty, so do not quote me on that. But it does feel like there might be some elements missing from some of the action sequences, from some of those slightly bigger set pieces. They do feel like there is maybe something else that should have been there. I don't know what. I'm not one of those people that believes that an R-rated movie or a movie that is geared towards adults automatically makes it better than a 12A movie or even like a PG or anything like that. But I do think that it needs to work within what it is that they are trying to do in this movie. And when it comes to Argylle, what it is that they are doing in this movie, I feel like it could have been a really good contrast and quite jarring for Ellie Conway, because her novels are very glitzy, very glamorous, quite nice and sleek, like a James Bondy style kind of thing. And I feel like that would actually be a really good contrast to what goes on in the real world. So when you have Aiden being introduced and all these people are getting absolutely massacred in the train sequence, in all the other action sequences throughout this movie, if it was a bit more bloodier, a little bit more gorier, a little bit more brutal, I think that that contrast would really stick out a lot more. And I think it would be quite a big wake-up call for her that this is really happening. But it's not really a deal breaker for me. It was just something that I wasn't really expecting. So for what it is, I did enjoy it as it was. I will be honest, the only thing that did really frustrate me about this movie, like properly frustrate me, is that it follows the age-old cliche that every action movie tends to do, where the plot takes priority, whereby you have the antagonists completely at the mercy of the protagonists, and of course they only get knocked out so that they can come back into the movie a little bit later on and be a problem down the road. It's just frustrating because there's so many moments where the protagonist actually has the opportunity to defeat the antagonist once and for all, and they just don't do it, or they just leave them unconscious on the floor and run away. Oh, but they massacre an army of goons along the way, but the main antagonist, oh no, that's too far. Anyway, I think now might actually be the best time to actually explain what it is that I was referring to in the intro for this video. Leading up to this movie's release, I got a little bit confused about the origins of this story, the whole Argylle premise, because there is a book that does actually exist called Argylle out there, and you can buy it in stores now. And originally I thought that the movie was based on the book, until I found out that the book actually hadn't been released at the time that the movie was in development. The book that is available to buy in shops is written by Ellie Conway, but Ellie Conway is just a pen name. Ellie Conway is just a character. She is the character in this movie. She doesn't exist. It's very similar to what it is that things like Lemony Snicket did, with Lemony Snicket is just a pen name, but he is also a character that exists within the world of a series of unfortunate events. And I've only just found this out, but apparently there is actually an Ellie Conway in a TV show called Neighbours. I don't think there's any connection there. The book itself is just like a tie-in to the movie. It's basically supposed to be as though Ellie Conway is actually a real person, and this is the Argylle book that is getting released in the real world. But for some reason, there is a small group of people on the internet, mostly TikTok users, who were convinced that the book was actually written by Taylor Swift. And there was all sorts of ideas and theories coming out that supposedly proved that Taylor Swift was the one who wrote the book. I think there's things like she wears a lot of Argylle sweaters, the backpack that she wears with the cat Alfie in it, apparently that's something quite similar that Taylor Swift has. There's a lot of diamond-shaped patterns that are sort of sprinkled throughout this movie, what it is that the characters are wearing, lots of background set designs, even like the book covers are quite similar. Apparently Taylor Swift does have a lot of costumes that that do have that pattern. I say apparently because I don't really know too much about Taylor Swift myself, but there were people who were absolutely convinced that she was the one who wrote the book, or at least wrote the story that this movie is inspired by. I know that Bryce Dallas Howard has said that I think a lot of elements of her character were influenced or inspired by Taylor Swift, but, and I'm sorry to break this to any Swifties out there, the book was not written by her. About a week or so before the movie was released, Matthew Vaughn was actually interviewed about this, and he got asked a question about whether or not Taylor Swift was actually involved in this movie, and even he seemed a little bit confused about it, to the point where apparently his daughter actually come up to him and was asking like, wait, you worked with Taylor Swift and you never told me? And he went on record and confirmed that no, she had absolutely nothing to do with this movie, but for some reason people just weren't convinced. It's only actually been like a couple of days or so since this has actually been properly revealed, because there was actually an interview with the Telegraph, I think it was, that actually revealed who the authors, two of them, are. The first one is Terry Hayes, who is an Australian novelist and a screenwriter, and the second one is a British author called Tammy Cohen. Apparently the director Matthew Vaughn approached Terry Hayes about potentially writing a book that would tie into the movie in some way when the movie was quite early on in development. And it was just meant to be like a fun little tie into the movie, and that's all it was really intended to be. It was genuinely weird seeing all these different theories circling online about who the identity of Ellie Conway might actually be, and it's the internet at the end of the day, so the theories were definitely blown quite out of proportion. It's definitely just meant to be a fun little tie-in to this movie, and that's all it's intended to be. Anyway, back to the movie. When it comes to the cast that is featured in this movie, there is a really star-studded cast that is involved in this film. Obviously, leading things is Bryce Dallas Howard playing Ellie Conway, and she is genuinely great overall. I was kind of curious about what direction they were going to go with her character because of the way that she is portrayed within the trailers, and especially earlier on in the movie. But it really surprised me seeing just how involved she is in the overall story of this movie. I like how much she is involved. I like how much she actually does get to do. She does way more than I thought she actually would. And when it comes to a lot of the action sequences, because there are a lot of action sequences sprinkled throughout this movie, I thought that most of them were going to be kind of geared towards Sam Rockwell and his character just kind of like just going through all these goons and bad guys and all sorts. But she does actually help. She does actually get involved in them. And I was quite surprised just how much she actually can get involved in them. And Bryce Dallas Howard really does give it her all. I do think that she is a great part of this movie. Her performance overall is genuinely great. I do like how she is able to balance the more sort of comedic sides and really emotional ones as well. And she does sell both parts really well. And then of course Sam Rockwell is in this movie. Sam Rockwell, as soon as they announced that he was in this movie, I immediately said he is probably going to be the best thing in this. And he absolutely is. He is absolutely excellent in this movie as Aiden. I do think that he has a really great role to play in this movie. He is a load of fun. He's really charismatic. He gets some of the best action sequences of the entire movie. And I like that he actually does start to become a bit more of an interesting character as the movie goes on. He's not like a one-note kind of character where he's just kind of like showing up, doing the action sequences and funny one-liners and stuff like that. They do use him properly. He does have a proper part in this movie. And I like that you do kind of see other layers to him. You do kind of see a little bit more about who he is and how he actually does fit within the story. Both Bryce Dallas Howard and Sam Rockwell do have a really good chemistry together. I really love seeing both of them working together on screen. They do work very well. I do think the characters do bounce off each other really well. And I feel like a lot of the strongest scenes are the scenes that do involve both of these characters. But there are a lot of people who were expecting this movie to be centered around Henry Cavill, who plays Agent Argylle, who is the fictional character within Ellie Conway's world. And he's not in this anywhere near as much as you might think he is. The marketing, the trailers, the posters, pretty much anything that you saw about this movie, the two biggest things that they were advertising about this film was either the cat or Henry Cavill. And even though Argylle is an important part of this movie, Henry Cavill is not actually in this movie as much as you would think. And that also goes for John Cena as well, who plays like his sidekick. They are fun, they are entertaining. I do like seeing them on screen. I do think that they do get some really interesting, really fun and clever scenes. But in terms of their actual contribution to the story, there is barely anything of it. Most of their stuff is kind of contained towards like the first half of the movie, and then it's just like a few little sprinkles throughout the second half. And this is actually why I said that the editing style for this movie can be a little bit strange at times, because how Argylle does get ingrained into this movie is that whenever Ellie Conway is kind of visualising whatever's going on, she kind of sees him instead. She sees Argylle sort of like getting involved in some of the action scenes, or she sort of interacts with him. There's actually some really clever scenes where she's actually writing up a chapter from her book, and it's being acted out with Henry Cavill and all these other actors. And then there's bits where like he'll sort of like say, you know, there's something that I really want to say, and then he'll just kind of freeze and be like, I don't know what I'm saying. And it's because Ellie Conway doesn't know what the character should say next. It's clever how it is done. I do like the visuals that they do come out with. But when it comes to the action sequences, that's where it gets a little bit strange, because the way that Henry Cavill is actually kind of integrated into those moments is Ellie Conway just kind of like blinks and then it like snaps between what's going on with Sam Rockwell as Aidan and Henry Cavill as Argylle, and it sort of flicks between the two of them to the point where it is kind of clever how it is done. It is choreographed really well, but how it kind of fits into the story, how it actually fits into the movie, it doesn't completely make a lot of sense. But it is memorable. There's not really much that I can really say about the performances from both Henry Cavill and John Cena, and like even like Dua Lipa as well. They only really have a small part in this movie, and they basically kind of play the roles that you expect them to play. So in that regard, I do think that they are good, but I do think that they were, or I think that they could have done a little bit more with them. I don't entirely know what, because it's not their movie, but I do think that they could have done something a little bit more there. But I do think that everyone who is involved in this movie does look like they are enjoying themselves. They are all giving some good performances. I really love Bryan Cranston as like the main antagonist of this movie. I love Catherine O'Hara playing Ellie Conway's mum. She's really fun. I'm not going to say how it is that Samuel L. Jackson sort of factors into this movie, but he does show up and he is fun. He is a really entertaining character. He doesn't really have that much to do, but it is nice seeing him. We also have appearances from Ariana DeBose as well as Sofia Boutella. They're fine. Again, they don't really get that much to do. But as I said, I do think that everyone is delivering a good performance, and I do think that everyone is having fun. They look like they are having an absolute blast making this movie, including the cat. Yeah, Alfie the cat. There's actually a little bit of trivia surrounding this cat, because apparently originally they actually did get a proper production cat, an actual actor cat. I'm not sure if it either just didn't really follow instructions properly or it just didn't really vibe very well with the actors. But apparently Matthew Vaughn actually decided to fire it, which I didn't even know you could actually do. And apparently what he ended up actually doing was he borrowed his daughter's cat and he used that cat in the movie. So the cat that is featured in this film is Matthew Vaughn's daughter's cat. I mean, he's pretty well behaved. I do like that there is actually a couple of scenes where Ellie Conway's walking around her house and she's got Alfie, and he's like staring over where the camera is, and it's like, I'm guessing it's because Matthew Vaughn's just off camera and he's just like, that's the person that I recognise. I do think that they do kind of overplay it sometimes with just like what it is that the cat actually does do and how involved in the story the cat actually can become. That's some of the moments that do kind of push the believability, do involve the cat in some way, but it's fine. It just sort of adds to the fun. As I said, everyone is good in this movie, but the standouts for me are both Bryce Dallas Howard and Sam Rockwell. I do need to talk about the action that is featured in this movie. This is a very action-oriented movie, so much so that I would probably say that this movie is more considered an action movie more than anything else. And in my opinion, I do actually think that the action is not only good, but it is one of the best aspects of this movie, because there's a good variety of different set pieces, different action sequences that are sprinkled throughout. Some of them are a bit shorter than others, and then others do go on a little bit longer than you probably would expect them to, but I do think that overall most of the action sequences in this movie are both decent and pretty imaginative. And part of the reason for that is because of a lot of the visuals that they use throughout this movie, because there is a very mad kind of over-the-top style that they do use when it comes to a lot of the visuals as well as the cinematography. And there are some moments where it does go a little bit more comic booky than you probably would expect it to, even though this movie is not based on a comic book at all. There are frames, there are images, there are shots in this movie that do feel like comic book panels. They do admittedly come out of nowhere, because there definitely are a few sequences, as I said, quite early on in the movie where it does try and keep it as grounded as it can, but then towards the second half it definitely does more embrace the more over the top elements, to the point where that's where the sort of comic booky stuff really sort of comes more into play. I do think that this movie has a very similar style to the Kingsman movies. I do think that there is a lot of visuals that do kind of echo what it is that they did in the Kingsman movies, and the overall sort of vibe and tone that the movie goes for is very similar to those films. And that also includes a lot of the wonky CGI. And because of how similar this movie actually does feel to the Kingsman movies, there was a little bit of me when I was seeing the marketing for this movie, the trailers, the posters, I did think that there might be a connection to the Kingsman movies. Don't worry, I'm not going to confirm or deny one way or the other whether or not this movie does have any connections to the Kingsman films. All I'll say is that this movie does have the possibility of either being connected to that franchise, being set apart of that world, or being completely its own thing. The director Matthew Vaughn has said that he does have ideas for what it is that they could do with a potential sequel to this movie. purely depends on how well this movie does in the box office, which doesn't really sound like it's going very well at the moment. But if this movie does get a sequel, I will be quite interested in seeing what direction they do take with it in the future. There is a post-credit scene that is featured in this movie. It does seem very likely that it is trying to set up a potential future for this as a franchise, but at this point in time there is absolutely no confirmation whether or not this movie is going to turn into a franchise or not. But I will be curious seeing where it does go from here. Anyway, I do genuinely like what it is that they do with a lot of the action sequences in this movie. They are pretty good overall. I do think there is some really good choreography involved. There is a little bit of me that does say that this movie does kind of lean more towards style over substance, and there definitely are a few moments where it does feel like that, but when it really does sort of kick off and it does become like this big over the top action movie, it does have some really fun action sequences. I think my favourite set pieces are the one on the train that is featured very heavily in the movie, and there is one sequence quite later on in the movie which I won't really spoil for you, but all I'll say about it is it involves skating, and I think that it is really creative and really fun. And I've also got to quickly mention the stunt choreography in this as well, because there are some really amazing stunts that are used in this movie. Some of them actually do feel quite brutal. I mean, especially since this movie is a 12A, as I keep saying, but it does feel quite painful sometimes. There are some things that they get up to that do look like they do really hurt. The stunt sequences, the action sequences, they are some of the best moments in this movie, and I really did enjoy them. I should probably mention that this movie isn't actually a serious movie. There are definitely serious moments. There are a lot of dramatic, dark moments that are featured in this movie, but it does maintain a slightly lighter tone. There is definitely a lot of comedy that is injected into this movie. I have seen some reviews say that this movie actually is classed as a comedy. I wouldn't really go that far. There are some funny moments. There are definitely a few comedic elements that are thrown into this movie. Some of them do work quite well. Some of them don't quite land, but the ones that do are genuinely quite funny, and they will get a laugh out of you. And when it comes to the CG and the effects that are used in this movie, as I said, they are definitely a little bit wonky, and I definitely think that they could be improved in some areas. It is okay in some moments. I do think that when it comes to like a lot of the Argylle sequences, whenever it is that it's Henry Cavill's action sequences, I think that it's actually okay for what it is that they are trying to do in those scenes. But when it comes to the real world and what it is that both Ellie and Aiden are going through, I do think that probably it could have been tweaked a little bit here and there. There are definitely some moments where it is a little bit more noticeable than others, especially when it comes to sequences involving green screen, when the characters are standing in these magnificent surroundings and it's very obvious that they just aren't there. And then during a couple of the action sequences, there are moments where the stunt doubles take over, and what it is that they've done is they've CGI'd over the faces of the stunt doubles with the faces of the actors, and it is a little bit noticeable. This has become a bit of a problem over the past few years with a lot of the bigger movies that are getting released in cinemas having very subpar effects, but it is not the artist's fault. A lot of the times deadlines get changed, they get brought forward or pushed back, and then there's a lot of times where it is that they're basically just overworked to the point where they're working far longer in a day than you should normally do. And I'm hoping that something does happen with it eventually, because this is something that does need to get fixed. Anyway, I do like a lot of aspects that are featured in this movie, a lot of the sets, a lot of the set designs that they use, as well as a lot of the costumes that the characters have to wear, even like the hair and makeup, even though it is a bit weird when it comes to like Henry Cavill, because he's got like this almost like a Jonah Jameson sort of style look. But it does make sense when you do see what's going on in the real world, because there are action figures that have been created in this movie that are centered around the characters that appear in Argylle, and Argylle's action figure does look very similar to how he looks in the movie. There are some really good details when it comes to a lot of the costumes and a lot of the sets, because they do feel like very lived in places, even though there is a bit of a glossiness to them. I do think that they do work quite well for this movie, but it's not all just green screen or closed off sets or anything like that. There are some real locations that they do use in this movie, and I do like the places that they chose to be featured, because even though I feel like the scale of this movie is quite small, the locations that they go to does make this feel a lot bigger than it actually is, and it really does add to that sense of adventure that you do want to see in a spy movie. All of that are aspects that I was hoping would be good in this movie from everything that I was seeing in the marketing, but one other aspect that I was looking forward to was the soundtrack composed by Lorne Balfe. And the soundtrack overall I do think is pretty good. I do think that it is very fitting for this movie. It does have the right sort of style and tone that the movie does have. It does match everything that's going on screen. I don't think it's as memorable as a lot of other soundtracks that are featured in Matthew Vaughn movies like Kingsman, like Kick-Ass, like X-Men, like Stardust, but I do think that it is good overall. I can't really recall any sort of themes or any sort of like character moments or anything like that, but I do think that actually listening to the soundtrack on its own, I do think that it is pretty good. But one thing that I was expecting from this soundtrack is a lot of songs, a lot of needle drop moments that are featured quite prominently in a lot of Matthew Vaughn movies, and there are some great ones that are featured in this movie, and some of them are automatically added to my playlist. I do think that the songs that they do use in this movie are pretty good. They are pretty fitting for the scenes that they are featured in. I think that there's only one that doesn't quite match up as well as the other ones do, and that's actually during a hallway sequence, which you have seen in the trailers with like lots of smoke and gunfire and stuff like that. I don't think that the song they use in that moment really fits as well as the one on the train, for example, but I did like the songs that they do use in this movie. I even like the one that Ariana DeBose was actually a part of. There is actually an original song that is featured in this movie. It's an original song that she co-created alongside Boy George and Nile Rodgers, and it does have the same sort of disco-y kind of vibe that a lot of the songs that are featured in this movie do have, and I honestly thought that it might actually be a song from that time period that I've never heard before. So I was actually quite surprised when I was doing some research for this video that it was an original song and she was the one who sung it alongside Boy George and Nile Rodgers, and it really was quite a fun little surprise. It does suit the style and tone of this movie, and I do think that it does work very well in its own right alongside the other songs that are featured. Overall, I think this is just a fun action movie. It's a very ambitious movie with some interesting ideas and concepts, with a decent cast, music, action scenes, sets and locations, but unfortunately it can be let down by a muddled editing style, a very dense plot with lots going on and lots of moving parts, some very ropey CG and green screen, as well as some sequences that do push just how far you're willing to suspend your disbelief. When it comes to me, I did enjoy it for the most part, and I will say that it is nowhere near as bad as some critics have made it out to be, but yes, it definitely could have been better, and it doesn't come close to Matthew Vaughn's best work. I can't really say that this is a must-watch movie, and I don't think that you're really missing out on anything if you did decide to give it a pass. But if you're looking for something to watch to pass the time, I think that you'll have some fun with this. I enjoyed Argylle for what it is, and I did have fun with it overall. So with all that being said, my rating for Argylle is a 6 out of 10. As I said, I don't think that this movie is as bad as some critics have made it out to be, but it definitely could have been better. It's just a fun and entertaining action movie, and I am glad that I did get to see this on the big screen. It was an entertaining watch, and I did have fun with it. But anywho, that is pretty much everything I want to say for this video, so if you have watched this video, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe, and be sure to hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that's going on here. If you have seen Argylle, and it doesn't sound like there's many of you, let me know down in the comments what you think of it. Plus, if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you would like to see me do, let me know down below. But until next time, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. See you guys.